Welcome to the panel, Women in Crisis. It's the last panel, but I promise to keep you awake. We have the most diverse panel, not in a sense of gender, obviously, but in the sense of geographical and professional experience. I'll start with my colleague on the left, with guess what, named Sonja also. We decided that in order to participate in BSF, you need to have some Sonja connection to be a proper representative. So Sonja Lokar comes from nearby, it's not really next door, but it's very close, Slovenia, a long-time feminist activist with experience both at home and in more than 30 countries abroad. She's an expert on challenges that women face during transitions of different kind of political and economic and post-conflict area. And most recently, she has been engaged in Tunisia and Morocco, and I guess her first degree in French has helped with that engagement too. So she is capable of talking not only about the gender equality in an EU member state, but also of gender equality in transition states and post-conflict states. Next to her is our friend from Libya, Alaa Murabit, one of the two panelists who has this privilege to be the first in something. So Alaa was the first female representative in her student council. It sounds like a little personal story, but I think it's important to show the pioneering work that she did first during her studies and now that she's doing as a leader of the Voice of Libyan Women, an NGO dealing with gender equality issues in Libya. It's great to have you here, Alaa, and we move now to a colleague coming from Asia. So far we have Europe, North Africa, and Asia. Ismat Jahan was the first Bangladeshi female diplomatic representative to the UN agencies in New York. She's a career diplomat, currently serving in Belgium, in Brussels, as a Bangladeshi ambassador to Belgium, EU, and Luxembourg. She has a very rich experience in diplomatic service, and important for today's discussion, she's a representative at the UN Committee for the CEDAW Convention for Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So it's great to have an official representative presenting the women voice also at this panel. And last and not the least, Erika and I had a great time last year at the last panel on women and security, so we decided to invite Erika again. And as a sponsor of this event, we also agreed on a very difficult question by the end on the purposefulness of organizations such as UN Women to make sure that you don't get a wrong impression that she's here just because the UN Women is sponsoring this. Erika is actually a long time researcher on issues of gender equality. She is an expert on family and welfare issues. She was leading a Center for Family Studies in Bratislava before joining UN Women. She has a long career in social research, so I think she is really qualified to talk about the topic of today's discussion, and this is how crises differently affect women and men, and what are the possible solutions. So I'll start with posing this first topic to my panelists, and I'll ask them to agree with this assumption that there is a different consequences for women and men, or disagree. Both answers are okay, but I would be very happy if you would highlight real-life experiences. So besides data and generic trends, it would be nice to hear real-life experiences you are aware of. And also, for the clarity of discussion, we have been discussing crises for 3 days. I would really appreciate if you would explain which type of crisis are you referring to. Are we talking only about the economic crisis or political crisis, or there are some other aspects of crisis that we might have underestimated during the last 2 days? So I'll start with Sonja. I mean, Sonjas are privileged at this panel, and I promise not to keep it like that until the end of panel, to see how the Eurozone crisis affect women and men in Slovenia, an EU member state.
First of all, I'm really honored and glad to be here and to be able to discuss at this panel these issues. And as I have to run to the airport before the end of this panel, I will try to make my discussion really short and to the point. First of all, whenever I think about the recent crisis in the Eurozone, I'm always comparing it to the crisis we were put through in the 90s. This was the crisis of the transition from one system to the other, and what is similar and what is different if I compare these two situations. And I would refer to what was said by our colleague here on the former panel, when she said that the global capitalism is in the hugest possible transformation, maybe for the last 100 years, because it has to base itself on green energy and on IT technology. And in all this situation, the problem of economic independence of people is in a totally different context than this was before. And this issue is of the crucial importance for women, I think, because of the structural barriers women still have and discrimination, which is still a general situation of women all over the world. Women, whenever the crises come in, are in a weaker situation than men are. They are economically weaker, they are politically less connected and powerful, and because of this, if there is no strong support for them to get over these discriminations coming either from international state, either from international actors or state associations, if you want, it's very possible and very likely that they will go backward and they will not even keep what they have already gained. And this is, in fact, the main feature of the crisis in this moment in Europe. For us in Slovenia, it started as a financial crisis, and the burst of the bubble in construction buildings became the crisis of the banking sector, became the crisis of the real sector, became the political crisis. We had early elections, and then as a solution, whatever government was in place was always one and the only one political solution were austerity measures. And when you look into these austerity measures, then you can see how they hit women and young people more than others. And I just give you the list of the measures that my government put in place only a few months ago. And it's really obvious how this affects women more than it affects men. For example, care for the sick family members. Before it was paid 80%, now it's paid 70% of the pay. Maternity or parental leave, mostly taken by the women, it's lowered from 90%, from 100 to 90% of the pay. Wages in public sector are frozen and lowered for 8%. The bonuses for better work do not exist anymore, and there is no promotion in wage classes in public sector. Who works in public sector? We know 80%, these are women. Food subsidy, which exists in public and in other sectors, is diminished in public sector for 3.5 euro per day. So what is my conclusion? That in the crisis in European Union, however it will be solved, it has to take into account that if the women do not get the opportunity to make from the care work a part of the European economy solution, they will lose. And here I stop.
Thank you for this input. I would highlight the experience of Sweden, who has faced economic crisis earlier in the 90s, and actually found out that one of the ways to go through the economic crisis that the country was facing was actually to develop more of female employment, that was the sustainable solution, that they found out that investing in women getting jobs and starting their businesses actually helped the whole country. So they are now trying also to implement this at the current moment. But we'll come to solutions a bit later. Let's hear Alaa, Murabit, about how are things in Libya these days, a very different context from the EU context. Are there really differences, and in which ways?
I think to answer your first question on crisis, whether it's political or economical or other, I think we have to remember that crisis is usually very interconnected. When there is political crisis, there will follow economic crisis, social change, etc. Libya had a very different situation in the sense that we are an economically sound country, obviously due to mainly natural resources, which will eventually run out. But that has not been a chief concern of the past 18 months in Libya. Our chief concern was the overthrow of a regime and of a dictator. When we discuss how that influenced women, as I think, I'm not sure how much the media portrayed it here, but our armed forces, our Libyan Revolutionary Army, is predominantly made up of men. I cannot name a single female fighter, and I have pretty good knowledge of that army. But nobody had ever put on TV what the women had done. It goes without saying that if a city is empty of men because they are all fighting in the mountains or elsewhere, there's a city literally being run by only women. In a country like Slovenia or America or other, it may seem normal for a woman to go out and get her own groceries, or to go driving and drop off her kids and pick them up, or to go to work every day. In Libya, it was not. It was not common for a woman to go at 8 p.m. to fill up her gas tank. And when I say fill up her gas tank, I mean wait 8 hours in line because we had no gas in the country. These things were not common for us. Women working was not necessarily very common for us. We have a lot of women, as you said, in the public sector who work as teachers, going in at 8 a.m., being home by 12 p.m. But to do actual labor on their farms, etc., because all of our workers who come from neighboring countries had gone home. So there was a lot that was picked up by women in crisis that we never consider. That's only during the crisis. You have to remember that, A, there's less security. So for her to be in her home, she never knows who may come in. She never knows what may happen. And, of course, post-crisis, you have the men who come home and who have seen a lot and who decide to take it out on their families. You have the men who come home missing a limb. And who takes care of them? Their mother, their sister, their wife. We do not have social systems in Libya in place which support amputees, which support PTSD. We don't have that yet. We have no institutions in our country. And so a lot of the burden has gone on women. And the downside to this, I don't think you will ever meet a Libyan mother who says, I'm not happy to take care of my son. It won't happen. They're all very proud of what their boys did. But the downside is that they get no recognition and they have no voice in the decisions being made. It is okay. I completely support giving to your country and supporting this revolution in every way possible. But when it comes down to those political decisions, which state, okay, how much money will an amputee get? Missing people. The number one person suffering from a missing person in Libya is their family. Most missing people are men due to being political prisoners and otherwise. So it is their wives, mothers, children. And yet they get as much money as an average worker. They have no other source of income. So the question goes, why are these women who are so involved in keeping the country running and who were, I would say, more than 50% of the revolution, why are they not involved in the decisions following? That, to me, is the biggest difference in the way that men and women not necessarily react, but are treated in crisis, is that men are somehow given this, regardless of what the man did during the crisis, they are given this ultimate right to have a say in the decisions. One of the panelists in the previous panel had mentioned that it was a large protest in Benghazi yesterday against extremism. That protest was fully organized by women. Fully. That protest had 30,000 people walking down the streets, marching against anti-extremism. Where is it in the news? We have not seen it in the news. We do see the extremists who are blowing up things, etc., a small fraction, but we don't see the push made by women. And instead, we see a few pictures of women wearing full veils and people saying, well, these women are oppressed. How about the women how about the 17% who made it into Congress? I mean, there is such a discrepancy in the way it's even portrayed, I think, internationally. And that's a huge downside as well. The last thing I wanted to say was, before the plenary, we had been sitting and talking about the major influence on women, and our organization, the Voice of Libyan Women, did a security and security provision assessment of women in Libya. And we visited some of the hardest hit cities by the war and some of the least hit cities during the war, according to, I guess you could say, Libyan ideas. And one woman had said something, I think, very profound when she said that women have all the risk, but none of the control in war. And she had likened it to driving. And I don't know who here has visited a Mediterranean country like Italy or Libya, but we don't know how to drive. We go about 200 kilometers an hour, and it's very bad. And usually it's young men who are doing this. And so she said, when my son is driving in the car, he knows when to stop, he knows when to start. He feels comfortable, he feels in control. I sit in the passenger seat grabbing the door, scared for my life. And she said it's very much the same in war. My son has the gun. If my son gets in a fight on the street, he yells at the other person, he yells back. I sit in the passenger seat. I can be as equally harmed, but I have no actual control of what happens. And I think that's the most profound way to look at women in conflict.
Thank you for this excellent portrait of how conflict can create, and crisis can create also opportunities for women to conquer new spaces, but how difficult it is later on to conquer the representation and voice in decision-making on governance. But let's hear from someone who has conquered this voice in Bangladeshi diplomatic service. Ismat, what would you highlight as the main differences in how crises affect women and men?
Thank you very much, Sonja, and let me also thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to be in this panel, and even women for making my participation possible. When I looked at just a little bit of digression before I address this explicit question, when I looked at the agenda, I thought, we were the last in the program, the third panel on women. I was thinking whether, it is by default or by design. But I'm taking it in a positive note. I would say that women should have the last say. So perhaps we can say that we are going to have the last say, but that's not the... But I was very happy to see so many men in the audience, because that only shows that this is an issue where both men and women need to be together in times of crisis and also in times of peace. Now to address the issue whether I agree or not, whether crisis affects women and men differently. Yes, my simple answer is yes, because experiences show that women, because of their sex and pervasive gender hierarchy, are affected in a major way, and which is different than men, because it is power relations, and in times of crisis, this power relation is even more pronounced on two levels. On the issue of gender hierarchy, it is usually men who are seen to be aggressive. Well, not necessarily so, because nowadays we also find that women are not only victims, but they can be perpetrators, and also they are all encouraged to be agent of change. So the role of women are also changing in times of crisis. But when we look at the issue, firstly, I should say that the gender-based violence is more pronounced against the women in times of conflict, whether we are talking conflict with political conflict or in terms of crisis, economic crisis, which Sonja had mentioned in the beginning, or a crisis related to natural disasters, which is very prominent in many parts of the world. That means when there are less available, the women are the ones who have to undergo the sacrifice. So it is a thing about, gender hierarchy and who gets what, and the overall pervading scenario of feminization of poverty and the roles. But I think, media is another aspect which Alaa had reflected to. That is, media or in a general portray of women as the weaker sex. But when you talk about women taking up different roles, they indeed play multifaceted roles in terms of crisis, sometimes as activists. We have seen in this part of the world, and you know best how the women in Serbia have played, and other parts of the former Yugoslav countries have played women in forming public opinion. So that is very important. When men were busy devising strategies how to win war or how to execute warfare, women, well, there might be exceptions, but in general, women have been focusing on a more conciliatory role to bring together peace and to denounce violence. But women also play roles in a very general terms as mothers, as sisters, as caregivers, and also we have seen unfortunate ways they have become victims of the war, like sex slaves, where also giving vulnerability to prostitutions and trafficking. So women are more affected in those areas than men. And I feel that in terms of access to justice, women are also ignored, because if women are raped, it is not taken much into cognizance, even by the women themselves. They rather like to be silent than to press charge. It is the society. I can speak in terms of Bangladesh's experience. Many of you might be knowing that Bangladesh also had a very violent birth in 1971. It's some 41 years ago. We split from Pakistan. But there were many women who were victims of rape. The figure goes 250,000 women, because we have a very huge population, and out of that 250,000 is very much possible. These women also preferred to be silent because they were given the title of war heroine, but nobody would come forward and take that title. Even from the families, from the communities, they were asked to be quiet and just forget it. So there was the issue of reparation never came into being, the issue of access to justice. So women gets neglected not only in crisis time, but also in post-conflict situations. And yes, there are positive opportunities coming out of crisis, because then we look at the post-conflict scenario when new constitutions are being drafted, new legal reforms are being taken. So these are the times when women, the civil society organizations in particular, can mobilize support to get into the gender issues in the new constitution, issues of equality, issues of leadership. So I believe, out of that positive, negative conflict, there are opportunities for women. And one issue I thought, it was important to mention, that in times of war, women take up many so-called unconventional roles. I mean, they are the main supporters of the family because the men have gone to active fighting. So they become empowered in that respect. But in the post-conflict scenario, when the men find that their women have now more employment opportunities, they are more economically viable, then they feel that their role as a bread earner or winner is been threatened by the wife. So we see that domestic violence becomes rampant, not within the context of conflict situation, but in also post-conflict situation. So answer, I can go on and on this, because I see that women do bear the major brunt whether it's conflict or peacetime situation and post-conflict situation. So what we really need to do is to see that they are not neglected, women are not neglected by bringing in, I think we are going to talk about how to bring in women side by side men in the context of peacekeeping, peace building, and peace making. It is very crucial in all the 3 stages. It's very important to have women together. There are a number of standards. We can talk about 1325 and so on and so forth. But unless everybody realizes, unless the men in particular and the women, of course, realize that it's important to have a partnership, it would be difficult to see that they are not affected differently. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this holistic overview of both the challenges and some solutions to the threats to women needs and security. We'll move to the question of solutions soon, but let's give the floor to Erika. What's your perspective on the major differences in the burden that women and men face in the time of crisis, and which type of crisis do you see as the most important?
First of all, let me start with apologizing that I am on this panel, because as a sponsoring organizations, we were trying to do our best to get a special rapporteur of Secretary General, and he's a male, to be with us, but unfortunately in the last minute he canceled. That's the only reason why I'm here, because I'm a humble listener to people who are sitting here, and I came here to learn and to listen. I would like also to touch upon a little bit on the discussion about the crisis, because as we all learned and we know, crisis has many faces, and it's very difficult to divorce, let's say, economic crisis from political crisis. There are crises which lead to armed conflicts, and all these type of crises, as my colleagues already said, are not caused by women, but women at the same time bore the main brunt of the crisis and implications. There was a colleague on the previous panel who said, like, all these crises are really something not to be very optimistic about. And he quoted, I think, or he referred to Winston Churchill, but I would like to remind him that one of the famous quotations which I really like and I try to follow by Winston Churchill is that I am an optimist, and it doesn't seem to be much more of use to be anything else. So I think this is something what during the times of whatever crisis is a leading motto, which is so typical for many women. Women are looking to the future, and they are trying to find the solutions. When it comes to how the crisis, whatever we define it, impacts women, or how women are reflecting the crisis, or what are the needs of women during the crisis, it really depends on what stage, what type of crisis we are talking about. And from the studies made by UN Women and other organizations in the world, which have done, for example, needs assessment of women in conflict, you can learn that the first thing women need is to make sure that their families are fed, their communities are together, that they have the basics, and very often they risk their own personal security to get these basics. In post-conflict situations, women are usually looking for health care. That's their main concern. They are looking for education for their children because they are looking to the future. And they are looking for employment. They are looking for the way how to secure their economic independence in many countries. We have quite interesting experience working with civil society organizations also in this region, and recently we organized something which is called Open Days. For those who don't know, Open Days are an opportunity for civil society organizations to meet with the highest representative of UN in the country and to share their concerns about security. And I think this is something what I would like to share with you, and maybe there are colleagues from civil society, Serbian civil society in this room, who met with the resident coordinator and shared their concerns. They were not just women from Serbia, but women from Bosnia and other countries, because as you have certainly heard, if there is any network, strong network in this region, it's a network among civil society organizations, women's civil society organizations. And their concerns 20 years, almost 20 years after the conflict, were around organized crime, corruption, access to justice. So, you know, they are different demands, but they are also very different from priorities set up by politicians and by men. So, yes, there are differences between men and women when it comes to setting up priorities during the crisis. And the biggest problem is that also men's priorities, or where the majority of power holders are men, which is the case always, are not legitimate. They are very important. They usually are not met with the needs expressed by women, because women don't have access to where the decisions are made.
Okay, so far we have talked about women being victims, or women being part of solution but invisible. But we have not addressed the issue if women can be part of a problem. And back for my, sharp statement, but are all women really for liberal solutions, for peaceful solutions, for more security? Or women can also, especially in a time of crisis, can also support populist, pro-war activities? And if so, why do they do so? Or you don't agree with me that women can also be part of the problem? The silence. I have a volunteer, Alaa, first.
I think it's ironic that we choose to lump all women together. I mean, I don't see why we have to do that. We never say, well, are women either the victims or... No. There are some who are victims, and obviously there are some who are perpetrators. It's human nature. It's funny to me that we want to separate it, but I think that as much as some women are victims, people make their own personal choices when it comes to conflict, women and men. And conflict, a very, very intelligent person, my father actually, once told me that conflict brings out the very worst in people. It either brings out their very best or their very worst. And that does not change whether you're male or female. So I don't think it's really a question I would like to say. I mean...
Yes.
I would like to turn the question around. I would ask myself, how strong are women of today now in Europe, in our transition countries, to be able to set up together with men, on equal footing with men, the new development priorities, which are obviously necessary to be set. And what is paradoxical for me, we never had a bigger number of women politically engaged in European Union as we do have now. Even in our countries, we never had more women in the parliaments, for example, as we have now. But when we compare the power within the parties, their power within the governments, their ability to really set up the agenda for the solution of the crisis, we can see that their power is still, I would say, very modest. So for me, the question is how to focus on the most important. And the most important is to really form a pan-European coalition of women on parity, to have 50-50 in decision-making, not only in the parliaments, but also in the governments, and also in the economic bodies which are taking crucial decisions, in the banks, in the big companies, etc. Another thing I think we need, women, in many sense, we are on equal footing with men, being equally or even more educated than men are, being fully employed in many countries in a very high level. In Slovenia, for example, it's 50-50. We have 50-50 of full employed people in the workforce, and women are better educated than men are. But there is still a question of, for a woman being a mother, it's not something that she can only choose. She's always seen as a potential mother, and this has consequences on her possibility on the labor market, and being really in command regarding our reproductive rights. It's a crucial thing. And if you look around the European Union, you can see how the attacks on women's reproductive rights are becoming stronger and stronger and pushing us out of command, even in the countries where this was already a solved problem. And the last thing is about economic independence of women. If we are not in the parity situation, if we cannot control our reproductive possibilities, then it will be very difficult to make of the care work and a part of the solution for women economic independence, and for women possibility to choose not to work only in the care economy, but in all fields of life. So for me, these three coalitions of European women fighting together to really push decision makers to take us seriously in these issues are crucial. And this is what I think is on the agenda of the women's movement in Europe today, and we have to really work on it. And here is the question, are all women seeing these solutions the same way as I do? I don't think so. The unity of women's movement and understanding what are the priorities is something to be built. It's not something which has been given to us. And it's a lot of work behind this if we want this to happen.
I saw there was a volunteer there. Ismat, you were the first to...
Thank you very much. I think, one has to look at women in different aspects. Women as professionals, women in the ordinary life. I'm talking about women as mothers, and also women as members of the civil societies. So in different ways, women would play, to me, in my mind, different roles. It's not necessarily having women as leaders would mean that we will have more peaceful world, because experience shows, if we are talking here in the Chatham rule, I could say that when Margaret Thatcher was the first Prime Minister of UK, well, that was a mean achievement because she was the first woman Prime Minister. She was a role model. But at the same time, if you would see that during her time, United Kingdom went to war. Argentina, I'm referring to. And it was also during her time in the 1990 that she doubled the UK army in terms of Iraq. So it depends where the woman is put. Sometimes the woman is also constrained by the geopolitics and also by the perceived national interest. So in that terms, we cannot say that having a woman as a leader would make a peaceful world. And even when you're looking at later periods, like when Condoleezza Rice was the United States National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State, we have seen the reactions with regard to the two wars in the Second Gulf War and also with regard to Afghanistan. And then we now have Hillary Clinton. There are so many ongoing crises. United States has their permanent rep, a woman in the United Nations, Susan Rice. And we have in Europe Angela Merkel and also the Vice President of the European Commission, Catherine Ashton. So there are so many women. I'm talking in the West, and also in the East. In my own country, the woman is a prime minister, and our foreign minister is a prime minister, and our home minister in Bangladesh is prime minister. My issue is that having women in a decision-making level, not necessarily, I'm not saying it does not, but I'm saying it is not a sufficient condition for peace, because they are limited by other issues of geopolitics. Global geopolitics, unfortunate as that may be. But as ordinary women, I would think that they are not really a problem, as you said. They are more of a solution, because women, we heard in Libya that they did gather together demonstrations which are anti-conflict. It's more to bring together peace, because women see that conflict I'm talking about an ordinary mother or a sister, who would like to see that her son or her father or her husband is safe, and how we can ensure safety is through pacific and peaceful thinking. So in that way, a woman differs. And the third is, when I talked about the women's civil society organizations, they are very strong force. In times of crisis, as I said, to bring up the media portrayal that there is a need to be pacific, and more. So even though yet we don't have that media focus, because nowadays social media has considered to be a blessing, and also, not a blessing, because sometimes it fumigates and crisis situations. But I think then woman plays a different role. So it is a mix. I'm sorry, I was not able to come to a conclusion, but okay. It is women in multifaceted roles act differently for different reasons. Thank you.
Thank you. We didn't ask for black or white response there. Many colors of gray in this answer, but I just wanted your analysis. Erika, do you want to add something on this topic?
There is not too much to add, but the truth is that it would be certainly wrong to look at women as a homogeneous group. That would be wrong. And we can always find role models, women who are fighting for women's empowerment, and we can find women who don't care about women's empowerment. So to single out examples, it's not probably the best way. Also, we are always looking for role models. So if they are positive role models, then that's very important. But what we have to care about is certain existing and prevailing pattern of subordination of women in the world and power sharing. And here the numbers are very clear, and I am not going to repeat what Sonja said about political participation. I am not going to say what others were talking or referring to in terms of economic empowerment. So numbers exist, and they don't allow you to ignore the fact that power sharing and women's participation in public life, in creating legislation, in creating spaces, in influencing budget allocations, public budgets, etc. These are the spaces where women are missing. They are not heard. They are not in, and it's not only about numbers, but numbers matter too.
May I follow up something Ismat has said, that depending on a role women performs, she might opt for a different strategy. And I wanted to follow up, since you're a representative of UN Women and you work both with the government and civil society activists and a feminist organizations and also women in a very macho organizations. Do you see a space for bringing these two groups together, or do you think that changing the situation for women would be better done through changing the perception of security and peace, or why do you work with both? How do you approach women with a very different perspectives of life and priorities?
I think it's a very difficult question, but absolutely legitimate, because we in UN, we have a very difficult situation when we are dealing with women's empowerment, because we are mandated to work with the governments, and we are mandated and we like to work with civil society organizations. And one of our role is to put these, especially if they have conflicting interests, to put them together, to facilitate the space for communication. Sometimes we fail. I'm not saying we are successful, but that's the role we play, and we believe that if these channels of communications are not open, it's exactly the same like not allowing women to voice their needs, to propose their solutions, but it has to be space created, like Belgrade Security Forum, for example, where all these ideas and solutions, problems, challenges are open and openly discussed. So I think this is one of our missions, and as I said, sometimes we fail, but we are optimists, and we believe this is the what we are supposed to do and we are mandated to do.
I'll give a privilege to other Sonja before because she has to leave to the airport, to give a short comment on our discussion so far.
I would just like to comment this last thing, because women are a physical majority practically in all the countries in Europe, but they are political minority in all the countries in Europe. The only way, if we want to have anything done within the mainstream politics, the only way we have is to work across all lines and to form issue coalitions on specific issues and push through the system, which is mainstream politics, which really decides about everything with the power of resources, political power, media power, whatever. So for me, this is the only formula, and it's really it proved to be really, really successful. But for the countries with young democracies, is the most difficult exercise to learn, because we have to understand to respect the other, to respect the different, and not to see in everyone who has a slightly different approach to the things that this is a mortal enemy we have to eliminate. This is very difficult to learn, but when we learn this, then we are the victors, because nobody but women in the societies, our societies, are working this way. This is how we hijack the mainstream politics, and the only way I have discovered is this way. And thank you very much, and I'm sorry I have to leave you in the middle of the discussion.
Sonja has left us a powerful message of need for coalition building, but I want to pick it up with Alaa and ask, you said that there are many women in Libyan Congress now. Do you think that this message is realistic? Can women sharing different perspective of the proper way of life come together around some topics? I mean, both, for example, women, from the West that think that every woman should have a right of abortion, and maybe traditional, for example, here, women, Orthodox believer who thinks that abortion is a sin, or in the case of Libya, I'm sure that there are differences of the proper way of life. Can these differences be resolved in a common interest?
Well, just about abortion in the West, that's very disputed right now as well. But I think that what we have to realize is, despite the fact that, and I agree that numbers are important, they are definitely a way to enter. And that's what they've acted as in Libya. They are a way to enter into the world of politics. But our election was quite interesting. We have 200 parliament seats. 80 seats went to political parties based on a vertical and horizontal list system, which means that it would be man, woman, man, woman, man, woman, downwards and sideways. And so that's why we have these women in. Only one woman won individually. So we have 1 out of 200 seats where a woman won it on her own as an individual candidate, because 120 seats were individuals. So out of those 80 political party lists, whether people liked it or not, there would be a large portion of women. That was, if your political party got 8 seats, there goes 4 women, or at least 3 women, etc. So these political parties also created coalitions, which helped women get in as well, because they wanted the men to get in. Having these women in the Congress, though, does not necessarily mean they have any influence at all. The exact opposite. We obviously could not get a quota. We initially had a 10% quota, and then it was revoked, and then this zipper list was put in. But more important than that is that the general public's opinion is that these women are in because their name was on a list, because they had to, more as seat fillers than as actual politicians. So I think before women can start creating cross-party coalitions or caucuses and such on certain issues, they need to, the whole parliament, men and women, needs to be trained on what their jobs are, but more importantly, there needs to be greater public understanding of women's roles in politics. Because if they were to create a caucus for women's issues, they would be labeled as those women who want women's things, who are only in there because we put them in there, right? So a lot of our women, instead of pushing for women's rights, have done the exact opposite, have completely avoided women's issues to show that, no, we're not women, we're politicians. So it's worked for us, unfortunately, the exact opposite. So when I see people saying, 17%, as much as the United States in our first elections, I'm like, it's fantastic that we have the numbers there, but we don't have the power, unfortunately.
Anyone, or we should give the floor to the audience to put questions. You want, yeah?
Very briefly, yes. The issue of coalition is, of course, very important because one needs to take on board everybody. But here it is also very important to try and eliminate the negative stereotypes that women often suffer in the society, and that is through education, and media also has a big role to play. And yes, it is critically important to encourage women's political participation. Quota is one thing which could be, because in Bangladesh we do have quota in the parliament for women, which has brought up the number of women in the parliament, but also they are also free to run for elections in their independent capacity, as I was referring my own prime minister and the foreign minister, home minister. They are all elected representative. But at the same time, at the grassroots level, at the local elections, it was fine with women even without having quota. The reason was quite impressive. One could say how it was possible, because those women at the local level, they were seen as leaders, and it was women who are active voters. I mean, in Bangladesh's experience, we felt that, the number of women who turn out in the voting polls are more than men. Women are more in number than men. So it was important to see that the women have a role not only as a participant in the legislature, but also in electing women to the legislature. But I think one issue is very important, that when we are talking about breaking into the traditional society, often if you're pushing too hard, it backfires. We have been looking at the Arab Spring to speak of. I mean, I really don't like the term spring because, unfortunately, it's not really the spring. It is really the winter, the bitter winter, if we could say. We have seen that, sometimes you're trying to push in women issues, but then they are getting at the back. So that is a challenge. How, in what ways to put up. It's a kind of incremental change in a way, but doesn't mean that we have to be complacent about it and let history take its own course. There has to be some proactive compulsion on the part of women as such. But what is too hard is also differently defined. But if we say that women in Egypt, for example, if they're coming out, and also in Libya, I don't know how far they will be able to mobilize public support, but in time they would be able to do so. Let's hope that.
Okay, thank you for that contribution. I'll open the floor for questions or comments. We have a few. Ms. Calder first, and then I think Maria is back. Please.
Yes, I was very struck by this question of whether more women means a better society, and I very much agreed with Ismat. I mean, having been very troubled by Mrs. Thatcher as our first woman prime minister. And then we see the Tea Party, we see Sarah Palin, Michelle Bachmann, and I notice in our country, and it may be true in others, there's a whole new breed of conservative women, very elegant, very articulate, and it's troubled me, and I think it all does have to do with roles. And the truth is that politics is based on gender roles. So the front politicians are always men, and the supporters and maybe the civil society is more women. And I think until you change, so it's really about democracy, until you change the relationship between politics and civil society, I don't think just getting more women. I mean, I think I'm in favour of that, and I hope it will because of the way women act. But I think the key thing is to change those roles. So I think that's a very important point. And my question to all of you was, I've always been very, very interested in the role of women's movements in conflict. Starting with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which was created in The Hague in 1915. Yeah, they met in Brussels. German and English women. And, you know, in Sierra Leone, for example, there was a fantastic women's movement which really brought an end to the military dictatorship. So I'm always coming across these women's movements, and I'd just like to hear, particularly about Libya, to what extent war is not only provides them with new economic roles, but actually is empowering politically.
Thank you for that question. I suggest we take another question from the middle of the room.
Hi, my name is Marija Marović, and I come from the Balkan Center for the Middle East, and my question goes to Alaa. My question is, in your view, do you see a new wave of Islamization? And by new wave of Islamization, I mean prominence Islamist political parties are gaining in the post-Arab awakening political structures, as, if I may adopt the forum language, crisis for women. If you know what I mean, if you understand what I mean. Do you see that as a crisis for women? Thank you.
Okay, we had a question here in the middle of the room. A man who really wants to ask a question stood up to get the microphone, so please.
Yeah, well, if I stood up, I'll remain as that. I'm Petar Milicevic from European Bureau for Conscientious Objection. I would have my own conclusion from this panel. Maybe I was aware before. A lot of wars started without a women. A man started a lot of wars, but there is no war that ended without active role of a women. So when you, Alaa, when you mentioned post-traumatic syndrome, we all imagine some soldier which is in traumatic syndrome. So war doesn't affect women. We don't have even a term for trauma that affects women during the war. So for me, what is most important is not the 17%. We had that problem in conscientious objection issue. Basically, if it affects men because they go to the army, they went to the army. That's one of the issues that was done very fast in Serbia. Maybe because it affects men only. I don't know. But still, there are a lot of percents doesn't help us a lot. For example, we have to be aware also that in some other cases, we cannot solve the issue without the women. For example, this crisis started, a lot of bankers started this crisis, a lot of politicians were men, and now we are asking for the solution to Angela Merkel. But no one asked this man, what's your fault? Who did this? Now we are putting responsibility into only basically one woman, which is the most powerful in this moment, maybe, from all the women in the world. I would ask for more non-formal ways of empowering women than to the formal ones, because those formal ones will always find a way to avoid. We are very good at avoiding formal ways of empowering men. So be free to invent some.
Thank you, Petar. And there is a question here in the second row, and then I'll give the panelists a chance to answer this first round of questions.
Thank you. Olga Mitrovic, International Organization for Migration. First, I would like to thank the organizers for, I think, providing us all with the opportunity to hear such valuable inputs from various backgrounds. But I would also like to ask the panel if we could focus on solutions a bit more, because what we could hear so far, particularly in the role of women in conflict, was this great change that happens when sometimes even war and conflict can act as a catalyst of change, and when a woman steps out of its role and starts keeping the family together, working, running in the country, etc., and after the conflict ends, it's supposed to step back into its previous role. And I think we all follow this assumption that after the fall of authoritarian regime, the gender equality will supposedly start to blossom. But seeing how the gender mainstreaming did happen in the past, let's say, decade with the 1325, with various instruments at the global level, that a lot of projects are aiming at gender empowerment, that quotas and seat filling, as you say, is happening, that we have tried already set of instruments and mechanisms to empower women, and that the message that I'm getting from this panel, it's still that none of it is sufficient, none of it works. Do we have some new ideas on how to change this?
Thank you for this very easy question for the panelists on innovation in gender empowerment. I see that there are more questions, but let's provide answers to this round of questions and then we'll open the floor again. I'll just remind of the demands on you. So the first question was if you want to continue inspiring our audience with examples of women movement during and before and after the conflict. The second question was on the consequences of Islamization of politics in some of the countries of Arab Spring for women's rights and women's position. Then Peter gave us a very emotional speech about how he wants to hear more about informal ways of empowering women. And I think he highlighted one of the points that was discussed a number of times during this panel, that naming does matter. I think the example you gave with post-traumatic syndrome that immediately brings to attention men, and the examples you gave of media coverage show us how much the representation in language and media matters to what we perceive as a problem. So any solutions to that too. And the last and not the least, and definitely the most difficult question by Olga was any new creative ideas or just suggestions how to make existing instruments more effective for women and men too. So volunteers?
If I may respond to the last question, because I think it is it's the closest to our work or our mandate. I don't think we need any specific new guidelines or any specific new frameworks at the moment, because as you for example said, when it comes to women, peace and security agenda. The first resolution, 1325, was adopted in 2000, and now we have 5 follow-up resolutions which are basically trying to focus on implementation of 1325, and we are still not there. We are moving somewhere. So I think it's a process, so to create more and more, let's say, normative frameworks doesn't help. I think the first step is to ensure that the existing ones, which have been developed based on experience and years of work of different actors, not just international actors, but inputs from civil society organizations, have to be implemented. They have to be taken seriously. It's not just to translate 1325 to National Action Plan, which is not budgeted, or which is just something which the government says, well, we have this plan, we can say we have this plan. It's really about the implementation, and I don't need to repeat it. Everybody knows that this is the biggest problem. So, and when we are talking about the crisis, I think what we are facing here is actually a crisis of accountability. So I think we have to focus more on that, and it's a process, That's why UN Women was created. That's in the mandate. That's why civil society organizations are demanding the governments to fulfill what they are supposed to fulfill. But it's a long process. We just have to find the way where to push, how to build capacities, how to make resources available, and use some soft measures like naming and shaming and media, etc., etc. It's very complex. So it's not a simple answer, but in my opinion, creating more and more normative frameworks doesn't help. It's like with more and more women in decision-making positions doesn't automatically trickle into the change. The change is more complex.
Thank you for sharing the first solution, making governments more accountable by pushing, monitoring, and demanding implementation. So we are tackling the solution slowly but surely. I see the two other panelists are keen to answer. Maybe to start with the question of Islamization, and you're both invited to answer this question. And then, of course, the other questions that were posed. So, Alaa, do you want to start? Because it was specifically addressed for you.
I think, first and foremost, the media has a very strong role in what is perceived as the Islamization of Libya or of any Arab Spring country. As I had referred to the protest yesterday, which ultimately 30,000 protesters burned down the Islamic Brigade in Benghazi. They burned down their base, but we don't hear about that. Unless you go and search it, you won't hear about it. What you will hear about is when that Islamic Brigade holds two people, what's the word? Hostage. Sorry, I'm losing my English. But we don't hear about the other side of the story. When we want to talk about is it a crisis for women, I think a lot of things will influence women negatively in the Arab Spring. Don't get me wrong, I completely support the Arab Spring. I fought for the Arab Spring, but I don't like that word. I don't know why I'm using it, for the Libyan revolution. But I think that it's not going to be an easy road. I don't know why people assume that something that took other countries 100 years is going to take us one. Oh, you women, you guys aren't as liberal as you should be by now. First off, and this goes also into the solutions, we can't give you generic solutions. I cannot, because solutions which work in Libya will not work in America, will not work in Europe. Solutions which work in America will backfire in Libya. So we have to be realistic. The solutions for us are going to take much longer, not because of Islamization, but because of the culture that we have. We have a culture which for the past 42 years sought refuge in, I would like to say, the social understanding of religion, not necessarily what religion really is, but what people rewrote it to be or misinterpreted it to be. And because of that, we have a culture which does, in a lot of ways, negatively impact women. But at the same time, I always hear people say the negative impact of Islam. Where's the positive impact of Islam? I mean, some of the only reforms in Arab countries have been through the use of Islam. So why not, instead of always looking at Islam as the problem, can we not start looking at it as the solution? The reforms in Morocco, why can't we say, let's replicate that in other countries? Let's take the book, which has only been interpreted by men, of course, and let's get women to start interpreting this. Let's get women to start talking about this. Let's get female scholars to go around to schools and to teach women that they should not be abused, that it is not in the Quran. Because when we take control, and I think that's the ultimate solution, when women can take control of the problem, they create their own solutions. So I think Islam, obviously, it's a huge political tool, and you'll see it in the media all the time. But I don't really think it's the big crisis for women. I think the big crisis for women is if they don't get organized, if they don't start to work together, if they don't start making money, and if they don't start trying to make decisions. That's where their problems will lie.
Thank you for that, Ismat.
Thank you very much. Can I just continue on what Alaa said? Because, I am also from a country where Muslim majority, and I entirely agree with her that how often Islam is portrayed also within the country concerned and by the international media as something which is totally in conflict with women's emancipation. I'll give you one example. It was in early 90s, I don't exactly remember the year. In the New York Times, there was a big headline that 40 women in Saudi Arabia were arrested for driving. And on that particular day, there was a group of U.S. Work College participants which visited our embassy in New York and met me and said, "Oh, how come you are from a Muslim country and a woman?" I said, "Excuse me, what's that got to do?" Said that, women does not allow women, Islam does not allow women to drive, but you are, I said, this is absolutely ignorance. You see in one country, it is their national law. I'm talking about Saudi Arabia, it's the national law, they don't allow. So it is their problem, but it's not an Islamic issue at all. Then I cited examples where our Prophet's wife, she was a businesswoman, and she was also the boss of the Prophet Muhammad. And then again, there are women who had gone to war during the period. So it is the interpretation And unfortunately, the interpretations are by male. So we also need women interpreters of the Sharia. Then we'd see that how it differs. So that is one issue. I thought, it is very important to know how international media portrays women and Islam. And but what happens in particular countries are very much political use of the religion. That's a different issue. Now, on the question of whether we need more innovative mechanisms to see how women are being addressed, the challenges of women are addressed in terms of conflict and post-conflict situation, I agree with Erika that there are a number of important standards, a set of standards. We have the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. CEDAW is celebrating its 30th year this year, and also the number of UN Security Council resolutions starting from 1325 onwards. So these are standards, fine. But what we need is not only action plans, somebody said that the implementation plans, because even but the standards that we have, these are not really implemented. For example, CEDAW, as a convention, when it was drafted, it did in its preamble look into the issues of women in conflict situation, and all the 16 articles of CEDAW can be applied both in conflict situation and in peacetime situation. But if I may add now, because the CEDAW is also now discussing to have a general recommendation which would solely address the challenges of women in conflict and post-conflict situations, their role as peacemaker, as peace builder, and peacekeepers. So we see now more and more conflicts are also becoming non-state actors are getting involved. So the convention is applicable to state parties, but how do we reach out to the non-state actors? That's a major challenge, because in many of the internal crises we find non-state actors are very, be it in Syria, be it in Libya, and in other crises. I'm just referring to the present one, and also in Africa, non-state actors. So the CEDAW general recommendation, when adopted, and we hope it would be adopted in 2 years' time, we're still in a consultation mode. We have done consultation with in Istanbul, in Addis Ababa, and Bangkok, trying to feel the pulse of different regions, not yet in the Middle East, which is very important. And we hope even women would take that on board, because they have been assisting CEDAW in that consultation. It is important to get the non-state actors and also the peacekeepers. The Secretary General has already said that zero tolerance for even peacekeepers who themselves are involved in violence against women in conflict situation, rape, for example, or even if not rape, sexual violence, which can be sometimes forced. That issue. And the general recommendation will also look into the issue of access to justice, which is important, and that will include reparation. And I've talked about the violence and violation of the civil liberties of women in terms of conflict situation and post-conflict, and their enhanced involvement in peace building in post-conflict situation. And the fourth most important is empowerment. I think you have mentioned the issue of empowerment. The draft recommendation would also see how to empower the women through creation of more income-generating activities, including microcredit, where women would be the beneficiaries. So I think, it is in many different ways. We have these standards. Those standards need to be strengthened. But what is more important is active ways of devising mechanism to see their implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions or comments? Okay. Wait, Dragana was first. Here in the first row, we had a question from a last round. Yes, I've seen your hand too. First.
I'm Dragan Petrovic from the Fund for Democratic and Polish Social Initiatives. I'd like to have some comments talking about, actually I would like to stress some things that I find important. Sometimes we all talk about the numbers and percentages and things like that, which I agree are conditio sine qua non to have a critical mass of women in decision making. But I think that when we have these quantitative changes, as for example we have now quite a good percentage of women in the parliament, etc., we should think very much of qualitative changes that should bring. What is exactly the consequence of the presence of that number of women? Are there any consequences? Are there any qualitative changes in the politics or not? And I can't agree much more. I mean, I totally accept that sometimes women decisions depend on geopolitical reasons. But I would like to stress that it also depends on different political options to which these women belong. And we should maybe think what is the impact of different political options on position of women, whether it is good to have a very narrow view or a broader view, what would bring better progress, what should be a pro-women politics, whether it should be a pro-human politics also, to be a broader accepted, because political options are important not only for women to be elected, but for women to be aware how to elect and how to vote to get qualitative changes from politicians. And don't forget, we need men together with us in this front and in this battle, because if we don't want to be put in a ghetto, isolated and said that's some women's business, we really need to work with men and to have as broad front as we can for such qualitative changes.
Thank you for this speech, which was inspirative and I think relevant to discussion. We had a question there in the third row. There, behind the cameraman.
Thank you. My name is Maja Piščević. I come from Serbian Association of Managers. And I'm very glad that I'm present at this panel, because I have also participated of some of the similar panels in different parts of the world. What I would like to add a kind of positive note as we're coming to the end of it. You know, we are still talking about the problems, about the issues that we are facing. But I want to just remind all of us that the change is already happening. And the situation today is much, much better than like 10 or 20 years ago. And we need to remind ourselves and sometimes maybe even congratulate ourselves on the victories that we have already won. And the battles that we have won. And also I'm thinking about the new ways and innovative ways how to address the issue of women empowerment. I think that the smart way is a humble way. And, you know, we have to remember that our male colleagues are, you know, the men that we struggle with every day. They were raised in the families where their mothers were most often inferior to their fathers. And we have to understand the problems in their minds to just have that, to make that shift and bring and understand the equality of men and women. In my ideal world, you know, on one of the panels sometimes in the future, talking about the women empowerment, we will be having men sitting there instead of women talking about it, the men like our men fellow who had this great comment a couple of minutes ago, talking about the importance of including women in all processes. Also, the humble way is the way of the quotas. It's a big issue, and there's a big discussion what we think about the quotas. And I'd like to quote someone who had a good statement of quotas with which I really agree. It was Viviane Reding she's an EU's Justice Commissioner. She had a great comment which I completely agree with. She said, "I don't like quotas, but I like what they do." And, this is the way to open the doors. When you open the doors, once you're in, you start to change. And one final comment, the role that we need to play is actually, of course, we need to talk like this. But the much bigger benefit to this issue is brought by our work. When we become the role models, when we become the change that we want to see in the world, when we have more of Sonja Lichts of this world, who organize all of this entire beautiful conference, and each of you sitting there, this is the way to bring the change, and this is the way to encourage our daughters and our young colleagues how to, move in the future, how to think about the future. Say, if all these women could do it, then maybe I can do it, and maybe I can try it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for even more inspirational speech. Hopefully some of the men are going to be inspired too to continue this discussion. I'll try to, there is one more? Sorry, I haven't seen. And then I'll try to wrap up the panel. Yes.
Ivana Savić, Ombudsman's Office of the Republic of Serbia. Just one more comment regarding the gender equality. I think what we're missing in this discussion is actually education for gender equality, because it's not enough to work only with women, actually girls. It's also important to work with boys, and having boys and men working toward gender equality, because gender inequality is not something that is given. It's actually you learn how to embrace those inequalities and to be something that is normal and acceptable. And another thing is, I also want to reflect what was said. It's a process, it takes a lot of time, and we also need to work on the prototype, on the model of the prototype, so we adjust, and also we have tailor-made decisions and solutions regarding gender equality. And also to congratulate you for this event, and also for having this kind of topic within the theme of security, and also supporting greater women participation, but meaningful women participation in security issues and also in democracy. Thank you.
Thank you for that encouragement. I see that there is a passion for comments, but I'll stop the discussion here if you don't mind, because we already start congratulating, and it's few minutes time before we start with that part. Question, okay. If it's question, it's opportunity for the honorary panelists here. So yes, you will be allowed.
Thank you, and I'll be very brief. Gordana Delic from the German Marshall Fund. The question is, most of the migrants in today's world are women, and consequently with children. And yet what we are seeing in a number of countries in the EU are new laws or old laws reformed, and I think the latest example was this summer in Belgium in July, that the law was reformed in terms of they wanted to make paperwork less complicated. However, the criteria for the people who apply for when applying for naturalization or for getting the Belgian citizenship were increased, and thus in favor of men, because they increased the number of hours that were supposed to be worked throughout the year, they increased the income, and so on. My question goes to Mrs. Kvapilova, because you come from the UN Women. How is UN monitoring this? How you plan, or how are you reacting to this? Who do you cooperate on this, and how can we help?
I have to say that there are probably some misconceptions and too high expectations from UN Women as an organization, and I wish we can fulfill all the demands. Technically, UN Women has a global mandate, but in reality, We are more or less still providing technical assistance in some countries. Even in this region, we are not working with everybody. We are not present everywhere. There are reasons for that. One of the reasons being that the organization was created, but it's still financed through voluntary contributions of the government, of the member states. And you know, voluntary contributions are not regular, etc., etc. So there are some capacity limitations despite our global mandate. So I don't think the organization really has capacity to monitor EU laws. But on the other hand, EU should comply with UN frameworks, internationally agreed frameworks. So I would say it's also a responsibility of European Commission to look to their own commitments. And here we go, and we are talking about accountability. If one of the priorities of EU is to promote gender equality, and they have a problem, that they should reflect on the problem. It's not to say that UN system shouldn't be interested, but I'm simply saying that the tasks and expectations are very high. Resources and capacities are not sufficient to monitor countries like Belgium. I think it's a very harsh response, but it's true. And what you are saying, I think it's very disturbing. And similar things are happening in other countries of European Union, in many fronts. Sometimes they are not noticed from different reasons. But from our experience, we know that, for example, when we have very strong civil society organizations aware of potential traps and implications on gender, they are the first who signal that this can be a problem. But, you know, we wish as an organization, we wish we had so much money and resources as we need for addressing all the needs, and we wish we had capacities at the country level, not in headquarters, to respond to the needs. But unfortunately, that's the reality.
Thanks for this answer. I'll wrap up the panel with if you allow me, some conclusions that seem to be repeated both by panelists and the audience. I think we all agree that men are part of solution, not just problem, and that we need men and involved men like Peter, and others. And next year we promise to have more men on a panel of a similar topic, which was, as told by Erika earlier on, planned for this year too. The second topic, which was started with Alaa at the beginning and continued, is that naming and the way this topic is presented influences the threats and problems women face and also the possible solutions. So the way we portray the issue and the language we choose also influences what is going to be possible and foreseen as a priority to be dealt with. And last but not the least, I think the theme that was constantly repeated is that numbers are necessary but not a sufficient part of solution, and that what we should focus on is a qualitative change of our understanding of security, rights, Islam, and other important concepts that are important actually for empowerment of women. And if you allow me, before thanking our panelists, I'll invite you to do something and not just to talk. Our friends from Women in Black are organizing a petition so that Serbia signs and ratifies the UN Convention to prohibit cassette ammunition, which I think is highly relevant for our state, and it's appropriate to mention it within the panel sponsored by UN. So I'll invite you to sign this petition. When you leave the panel, there is a table on the right where you can address the letter to the Minister of Defense, Aleksandar Vučić, supporting this initiative. And now please join me in thanking the panelists.